Welcome back to Read Aloud. I'm Dan. Today we'll be reading from Chapter 8 of The Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Vladimir Lenin. Chapter 8, The Utopian Karl Marx and the Practical Rosa Luxemburg. We'll begin with a summary or two. In Chapter 8, The Utopian Karl Marx and the Practical Rosa Luxemburg, LOL. Lenin goes, "Oh, Rosa wants to joke around about the idea of raising the demand for the independence of Ireland? Well, let me take that as an opportunity to teach you and our comrades about historically concrete conditions vis-a-vis the right of nations to self-determination and what Daddy Marx had to say on the topic and why it has changed as historically concrete conditions changed." Lenin then lays out the entire history of Marx's statements on Ireland and concludes by saying, "The policy of Marx and Engels on the Irish question serves as a splendid example of the attitude the proletariat of the oppressor nations should adopt towards national movements." This critique is directed squarely at Rosa, whose critique of the inclusion of the right of nations to self-determination in the Russian Marxist national program, or the oppressor nations program. When her critique of it makes less and less and less sense. I have another summary, and how about I leave that for later? Let's begin. Chapter 8. The Utopian Karl Marx and the Practical Rosa Luxemburg. The title is just dripping with disdain, you guys. He says, calling Polish independence a utopia and repeating this ad nauseum, Rosa Luxemburg exclaims ironically, "Why not raise the demand for the independence of Ireland?" Wait, why isn't anyone laughing? She brings it up. The practical Rosa Luxemburg evidently does not know what Karl Marx's attitude to the question of Irish independence was. It's a pretty fucked up thing to say, yeah. It's worthwhile dwelling upon this so as to show how a concrete demand for national independence was analyzed from a genuinely Marxist, not opportunist standpoint. He goes, "Oh, you want to talk about Ireland? Well, this is what I do. I break down historically concrete conditions." Lenin goes, "I am a machine that takes bad arguments and turns them into books or pamphlets on concrete conditions, concrete historical conditions, with regards to the right of nations to self-determination. His body is a machine." He says it was Marx's custom to sound out his socialist acquaintances, as he expressed it, to test their intelligence and the strength of their convictions. By the way, this here is blowing my mind. I love this. I want to learn more about this. If you've heard anything else about this, I'd like to. What kind of questions does he ask? I'm so curious about this. Not gonna lie, I sort of do this too. You know, when you're talking with someone new about politics, you know, in this day and age, when you're a communist, you're not going to necessarily come out and blurt it. You don't know how they're going to react. So sometimes you tiptoe around it, right? You sort of sound them out along the way. Reading on, after making the acquaintance of Lopatin, Marx wrote to Engels on July 5th, 1870, expressing a highly flattering opinion of the young Russian socialist, but adding at the same time, "Poland is his weak point. On this point, he speaks quite like an Englishman, say an English chartist of the old school, about Ireland." I would hate for all my letters to someone be unearthed. Like all my letters to my gay lover. Like, are you kidding me? Jesus. Lenin says, Marx questions a socialist belonging to an oppressor nation about his attitude to the oppressed nation and at once reveals a defect common to the socialists of the dominant nations, the English and the Russian. That is, failure to understand their socialist duties towards the downtrodden nations, their echoing of the prejudices acquired from the bourgeoisie of the dominant nation. He says, before passing on to Marx's positive declarations on Ireland, we must point out that in general the attitude of Marx and Engels to the national question was strictly critical, and that they recognized its historically conditioned importance. Thus, Engels wrote to Marx on May 23, 1851, that the study of history was leading him to pessimistic conclusions regarding Poland, and that the importance of Poland was temporary only until the agrarian revolution in Russia. The role of the Poles in history was one of bold, hot-headed foolishness. And one cannot point to a single instance in which Poland has successfully represented progress, even in relation to Russia, or done anything at all of historical importance. That's what Engels said. Lenin says Russia contains more of civilization, education, industry, and the bourgeoisie than the Poland of the indolent gentry. What are Warsaw and Krakow compared to St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa? Engels had no faith in the success of the Polish gentry's insurrections. Odessa. Excuse me. Lenin says, but all these thoughts, showing the deep insight of genius, by no means prevented Engels and Marx from treating the Polish movement with the most profound and ardent sympathy 12 years later, when Russia was still dormant and Poland was seething. When drafting the address of the International in 1864, Marx wrote to Engels on November 4th, 1864, that he had to combat Mazzini's nationalism, and went on to say, inasmuch as international politics occurred in the address, I spoke of countries, not of nationalities, and denounced Russia, not the minoris gentium. I feel like I don't know what that means, and I should have looked that up before. So we're just gonna do that quickly. Latin for lesser peoples or smaller nations. Wow. Learned something today. Marx had no doubt as to Marx had no doubt as to the subordinate position of the national question as compared with the labor question. But his theory is as far from ignoring national movements as heaven is from earth. Then came 1866. Marx wrote to Engels about the Proudhonist clique in Paris, which declares nationalities to be an absurdity, attacks Bismarck and Garibaldi. So we have a Proudhonist clique who doesn't believe in nationalities? As polemics against chauvinism, their doings are useful and explicable. But as believers in Proudhon, Lafarge, I don't know, and Loge, two very good friends of mine here, also belong to them. I don't do French, okay? Leave me alone. Who will think? Who think all Europe, these believers in Proudhon who think all Europe must and will sit quietly on their hindquarters until the gentlemen in France abolish poverty and ignorance. They are grotesque. Damn. That's what Marx said. Just two guys, not a cell phone in sight, writing letters to each other. That is the most romantic thing in the... Oh my God, I love this. Yesterday, Marx wrote, June 20th, 1886, there was a discussion in the International Council on the present war. The discussion wound up, as was to be foreseen, with the question of nationality in general and the attitude we take towards it. And we got to talk, we got a discussion, the question of nationality. The representatives of Young France came out with the announcement that all nationalities and even nations were antiquated prejudices. Proudhonized Stirnerism, he says, which is a little over my head. The whole world waits until the French are ripe for a social revolution. The English laughed very much when I began my speech by saying that our friend Lafarge and others, who had done away with nationalities, had spoken French to us. That is, a language which 9/10 of the audience did not understand. I also suggested that by the negation of nationalities, he appeared, quite consciously, to understand their absorption by the model French nation. Love that. The conclusion, Lenin says, that following from all these critical remarks of Marx's is clear. The working class should be the last to make a fetish of the national question, since the development of capitalism does not necessarily awaken all nations to independent life. I feel like we have a typo there. There's something going on here. That sentence doesn't make sense to me. Reading on, but to brush aside the mass national movements once they have started, and to refuse to support what is progressive in them means, in effect, pandering to nationalistic prejudices. That is, recognizing one's own nation as a model nation, or we would add, one possessing the exclusive privilege of forming a state. To brush aside mass national movements once they've started means to pander to nationalistic prejudices and what's the word I'm looking for? Privileges. Maybe I'll read this here. We also have a Marxist letter to Engels. I've learned with real pleasure from the Paris letters to the Times about pro-Polish exclamations of the Parisians against Russia. Mr. Proudhon and his little doctrinaire clique are not the French people. Okay. Lenin says, but let us return to the question of Ireland. After all, you brought it up, Rosa. Marx's position on this question is most clearly expressed in the following extracts from his letters. I have done my best to bring about this demonstration of the English workers in favor of Fenianism. I should be able to tell you what that is, but I don't I don't have that offhand. He says, I used to think the separation of Ireland from England impossible. Now I think it inevitable. Although after the separation there may come federation. Here he is. He's just like, he's telling you how and why he thinks about things. This is what Marx wrote to Engels on November 2nd, 1867. In his letter of November 30th of the same year, 28 days later, it's a great film, he added, actually I've never seen it, he added, I'm not really into horror movies, he added, what shall we advise the English workers? In my opinion, they must make the repeal of the Union, that is Ireland with England, the separation of Ireland from England. In short, the affair of 1783 only democratized and adapted to the conditions of the time. I guess. I don't understand what this means. An article of their pronunciamento. I'm not sure if we have a typo in here too. It feels like something's missing there. He says Marx says this is the only legal and therefore only possible form of Irish emancipation which can be admitted in the program of an English party. Experience must show later whether a mere personal union can continue to subsist between the two countries. What the Irish need is self-government and independence from England and an agrarian revolution. Marx attached great importance to the Irish question and delivered an hour-and-a-half lectures on this subject at the German Workers' Union. In a letter, this says letter of December 17th, 1867. And then in a letter dated November 20th, 1868, Engels spoke of the hatred towards the Irish found among the English workers. Almost a year later, returning to the subject in October of 1869, writing Il n'y a qu'un pas, or it is only one step, from Ireland to Russia. Irish history shows what a misfortune it is for one nation to have subjected another. All the abominations of the English have in their origin in the Irish Pale. Whew. Didn't want to do that. He says, I have to still plow my way through the Cromwellian period, but this much seems certain to me, that things would have taken another turn in England too, but for the necessity of military rule in England and the creation of a new aristocracy there. He loses me when he says, I have still to plow my way through the Cromwellian period, as in he's like reading it and studying it or something. I'm not sure what that means. Okay, reading on. Let us note in passing Marx's letter to Engels as of August 18th, 1869, about a year later, saying, the Polish workers in Posen have brought a strike to a victorious end with the help of their colleagues in Berlin. Don't ask why I said colleagues like that. I don't know. This struggle against Monsieur le Capital, even in the lower form of the strike, is a more serious way of getting rid of national prejudices than peace declamations from the lips of bourgeois gentlemen. Nice. Cool. That's cool. The policy on the Irish question pursued by Marx in the International may be seen from the following. On November 18th, 1869, Marx wrote to Engels that he had spoken for an hour and a quarter at the Council of the International on the question of the attitude of the British Ministry of the Irish amnesty. and had proposed the following resolution. Resolved that in his reply to the Irish demands for the release of the imprisoned Irish patriots, Mr. Gladstone deliberately insults the Irish nation. That he clogs political amnesty with conditions alike degrading to the victims of misgovernment and the people they belong to. That having in the teeth of his responsible position, publicly and enthusiastically cheered on the American slaveholders' rebellion, he now steps in to preach to the Irish people the doctrine of passive obedience. Holy shit. That his whole proceedings with reference to the Irish amnesty question are the true and genuine offspring of that policy of conquest, by the fiery denunciation of which Mr. Gladstone outed his Tory rivals from office. That the General Council of the International Working Men's Association expressed their admiration of the spirited firm and high-souled manner in which the Irish people carry on their amnesty movement. That this resolution be communicated to all branches of and working men's bodies connected with the International Working Men's Association in Europe and America. That is so fucking sexist. I hate this man. I can't read anything anymore. Jesus. I won't stand for the sexism. Working men? What about the working children? The children yearn for the mines, Marx. You're such a sexist and an ageist. Equal opportunities. I'm sorry, what was I saying? Reading on. On December 10th, 1869, Marx wrote that his paper on the Irish question, to be read at the Council of the International, would be couched as follows. Not really sure what he means, but he says, quite apart from all phrases about international and humane justice for Ireland, which are taken for granted in the International Council, it is in the direct and absolute interest of the English working class to get rid of their present connection with Ireland. And this is my fullest conviction. And for reasons which in part I cannot tell the English workers themselves. I don't know what that means. He says, for a long time I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. That's what he used to think. I always expressed this point of view in the New York Tribune. This is an American paper to which Marx contributed for a long time. Deeper studies now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything until it has got rid of Ireland. The English reaction in Ireland had its roots in the subjugation of Ireland. We're keeping in mind the quote, I think, chapter 3 or 4, I can't remember. He says something like, any nation that oppresses another nation, can it be free? No, it cannot. So, no nation that oppresses other nations can be free. Marx's policy on the Irish question should now be quite clear to our readers. Marx, the Utopian, was so unpractical that he stood for the separation of Ireland, which half a century later has not yet been achieved. What a dummy. Marx, you don't know anything. What gave rise to Marx's policy, and was it not mistaken? At first, Marx thought that Ireland would not be liberated by the national movement of the oppressed nation, but by the working class movement of the oppressor nation. England. English working class. Hey guys, throw us a bone. Marx did not make an absolute of the national movement, knowing, as he did, that only the victory of the working class can bring about the complete liberation of all nationalities. Only the victory of the working class can bring about the complete liberation. That's incredible. Someone should write that down, highlight it or something, Damn. It's impossible to estimate beforehand all the possible relations between the bourgeois liberation movements of the oppressed nations and the proletarian emancipation movement of the oppressor nations. The very problem which today makes the national question in Russia so difficult. It's impossible. However, it so happened that the English working class fell under the influence of the liberals for a fairly long time, became an appendage to the liberals, and by adopting a liberal labor policy, left itself leaderless. The bourgeois liberation movement in Ireland grew stronger and assumed revolutionary forms. Oh, bourgeois liberation. Oh, then we definitely shouldn't support it, right, guys? I'm a staunch Marxist. Wait, hold on. Lenin's telling me that sometimes we support those. Marx is telling me sometimes that we support those. Engels tells me that sometimes we support those. All these communist leaders are telling me that sometimes we support those. And they're telling me why we support those and when we do. Not all the time. And it makes sense to me. I don't know about you. Marx reconsidered his view and corrected it. Quote, what a misfortune it is for a nation to have subjected another. The English working class will never be free until Ireland is freed from the English yoke. Reaction in England is strengthened and fostered by the enslavement of Ireland, just as reaction in Russia is fostered by her enslavement of a number of nations. Just as reaction in America is fostered by her enslavement of a number of nations. Just like reaction in so-called Israel is fostered by her enslavement of a number of nations. And on and on. And, Lenin says, in proposing in the International a resolution of sympathy with the Irish nation, the Irish people, and then he says here, the clever LVL would probably have berated poor Marx for forgetting about the class struggle. What does that mean? I'm not sure what that means. He says, Marx advocated the separation of Ireland from England, although after the separation there may come federation. What does that mean? LVL? Who's that? I don't know. Reading on. What were the theoretical grounds for Marx's conclusion? In England, the bourgeois revolution had been consummated long ago. But it had not been consummated in England. It's being consummated only now, after the lapse of a half century. He keeps saying consummate. After the lapse of a half century by the reforms of the English liberals. If capitalism had been overthrown in England as quickly as Marx had first expected, there would have been no room for a bourgeois, democratic, and general national movement in Ireland. But since it had arisen, Marx advised the English workers to support it, give it a revolutionary impetus, and see it through in the interests of their own liberty. The economic ties between Ireland and England in the 1860s were, of course, even closer than Russia's present ties with Poland, the Ukraine, etc. The unpracticality and impracticality of the separation of Ireland, if only owing to the geographical conditions and England's immense colonial power, were quite obvious. Though in principle an enemy of federalism, Marx, in this instance, granted the possibility of federation as well, if only the emancipation of Ireland was achieved in a revolutionary, not reformist way, through a movement of the mass of the people of Ireland, supported by the working class of England. There can be no doubt that only such a solution of the historical problem would have been in the best interests of the proletariat and most conducive to rapid social progress. Things turned out differently. Both the Irish people and the English proletariat proved weak. Only now, through the sordid deals between the English liberals and the Irish bourgeoisie, is the Irish problem being solved. The example of Ulster shows with what difficulty, and that's where he loses me as well. I did not dig into that. He says, through the land reform, and I don't know specifically what he means by that, but I have an idea. He says, with compensation, and home rule, and that's also something I didn't look up. If you have any ideas, let me know. He says, not yet introduced. Did it get introduced? What does that mean? I don't know. I didn't look it up. Well, then, he asks, does it follow that Marx and Engels were utopians? That they put forward impracticable national demands? Or that they allow themselves to be influenced by the Irish petty bourgeois nationalists? For there is no doubt about the petty bourgeois nature of the Fenian movement. Okay, that helps me understand now. The Fenian movement, I assume now, is this Irish national movement, which are always going to be bourgeois in nature, right? I didn't look up the Fenian movement. Maybe that's what we do right now. This seems good to do. Fenian. Members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So like James Connolly guys. Okay, cool. So he says, he asks, were Marx and Engels utopian or not? He says, no. In the Irish question, too, Marx and Engels pursued a consistently proletarian policy, which really educated the masses in a spirit of democracy and socialism. And I think that's the point of this work. To be fair, I haven't read the conclusion yet. I haven't reread the conclusion yet, as I've read this book previously. But he's really not introducing any new theory in this, is he? He's not. There's nothing new here. He's building off the basic foundation of their national program, which is the right of nations to secede. Not that they necessarily support it in all cases, but they have the right. You have the right to eat a cookie. Do I support the right? Do I support the policy of you eating a cookie at all times? No, that's simply not good. That's not going to work. Okay? You have the right to drink alcohol. Do I think you should have the policy of always drinking alcohol all the time? No, you can't do that. It's not going to stop me from trying, but you can't do that. I'm just kidding. I'm not drinking any booze right now. All right? So again, reading on. Oh, definitely coffee. Yeah. So they pursued a consistently proletarian policy, which really educated the masses in a spirit of democracy and socialism. And that's what Lenin's doing here. He's not adding any new theory. He's using this as an opportunity to teach the masses about the spirit of democracy and socialism, using concrete examples in history to show people how Marx, how Engels, how Lenin, goes about analyzing the concrete historical conditions when analyzing the national problem in any place. This is what he does. This is what his body does. He says only such a policy could have saved both Ireland and England half a century of delay in introducing the necessary reforms, and prevented these reforms from being mutilated by the liberals to please the reactionaries. Many such cases. He says the policy of Marx and Engels on the Irish question serves as a splendid example of the attitude of the proletariat of the oppressor nations should adopt towards national movements, as an example which has lost none of its immense practical importance. It serves as a warning against servile haste with which the Philistines of all countries, colors, and languages hurry to label as utopian the idea of altering the frontiers of altering the frontiers of states that were established by the violence and privileges of the landlords and bourgeoisie of one nation. That is that goes so hard. He says, if the Irish and English proletariat had not accepted Marxist policy and had not made the secession of Ireland their slogan, this would have been the worst sort of opportunism, a neglect of their duties as Democrats and Socialists, and a concession to English reaction and the English bourgeoisie. Of course, he's doing this in the context of talking about the national question with regards to Russia. He's a Russian Marxist. Rosa Luxemburg is critiquing the Russian Marxist program for including the right of nations to self-determination. She critiques the International for having the same thing. She's really against the International here. Long-standing questions that have long been answered. She's attacking those. And, with regards to Russia, it's an oppressor nation. He's looking at the example of England and Ireland, and despite the fact that they have they have differences, there's that similarity, and he says the policy of Marx and Engels on the Irish question serves as a good example, a splendid example of the attitude, the proletariat of the oppressor nations, such as England or Russia at that time, or the United States right now, or Israel, so-called Israel, so-called United States. The attitude the proletariat should take in these nations with regard to the national movement. And same thing for communists. This is a basic test for communists, you guys. Does any communist party support the right of nations to self-determination? And when we speak of the right of nations to self-determination, are we speaking only of cultural or of political? Well, both, really. But it starts with political, does it not? Political and economic autonomy, or at least the ability to choose. And that's his. I think that's going to be my reading. Any other comments, questions from chat? It's going to be my reading here of chapter 8. Chapter 8, the Utopian Karl Marx and the practical Rosa Luxemburg. In this chapter, Lenin discussed how and why Marx and Engels' analysis of the Irish question changed over time, owing to historical developments. Bluntly, Lenin asserts that Marx had one position on the Irish question based on expectations of particular social developments, and some years later, upon recognizing those developments did not come to be as he'd expected, he reanalyzed and changed his mind. Marx also calls out several French guys for doing the mid-late 19th century version of All Lives Matter. was a summary provided by a member of the community, Rivethead. Thank you, Rivethead. If you enjoyed reading this with me today, and if you want to support my content, well, feel free to do so. You can do so with a subscription on Twitch. You can support on Patreon. You can support with a one-time tip. You can tip via Cash App, Venmo, PayPal at iDanSimpson, or if you need the email, it's iDanSimpson@gmail. Thanks for being with me today. Catch me next time. We'll read Chapter 9 on the National Question. Chapter 9, the 1903 program and its liquidators. If you're with me live, sticking around, if you're watching the replay, check out the next chapter. We'll see you then. Love your face.